Hello, and thank you for viewing this online tutorial on submitting data in support of fixed broadband availability filings as part of the FCC's new Broadband Data Collection, or BDC. I'm Kirk Berge, counsel to the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force. This tutorial will cover the supporting data that fixed providers must submit if they choose to submit Polygon data. It is a companion to two other tutorials on how BDC filers can prepare their fixed broadband availability data submissions for filing in the BDC. The first of which describes how to prepare fixed availability data for the BDC and some of the parameters required for that data. A third online tutorial we are releasing as part of this series provides more in-depth information about the FCC's Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. This tutorial is part of a broader set of technical assistance materials that the FCC is making available to broadband service providers, governmental entities, consumers, and other stakeholders who will contribute data and information through the BDC to help improve the FCC's data on broadband availability throughout the United States. You can find additional information and resources on the BDC by visiting fcc.gov/broadbanddata. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this tutorial and for your efforts to be prepared to submit broadband availability data as of June 30th. I will now turn it over to Michael Ray, an attorney advisor in the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. Mike?
Thanks, Kirk. All filers that submit fixed broadband availability data in the Broadband Data Collection System must also submit certain supporting information to provide insight into how they generated their availability data. All fixed broadband providers must explain how they, or their representatives, generated their coverage information. Governmental and third-party entities that choose to submit verified availability data must provide information on the identity of the entity that gathered and/or analyzed the submitted broadband availability data. So, for example, a contracted engineering firm, as well as an explanation of the methodologies the entity used to gather, organize, and verify their data. Filers that submit fixed wireless broadband availability data as a coverage map, as opposed to a list of locations, are also required to submit additional categories of information. The bulk of the discussion in this tutorial will cover these additional categories of data. All of the supporting data must match the specifications found in Section 7 of the following document: the BDC data specifications for biannual submission of subscription, availability, and supporting data, availability data specifications document, also referred to as the data specifications document. So please look there for additional information. All fixed broadband providers must submit information on how they or their representatives generated the availability data for each technology included in the submission. This information includes a description of the methodology or methodologies used to generate the data and an explanation of how the methodologies were implemented. For certain technologies, filers must enter the longest distance of a location from the aggregation point for purposes of evaluating whether the maximum buffer requirements have been met. This information on methodology is submitted via a web form in the Broadband Data Collection System. Governmental and third-party entities that submit verified availability data must also submit via a web form in the Broadband Data Collection System an explanation of how they've gathered, organized, and verified the data submitted about each provider. If the entity relied on another firm or organization for the collection and/or verification of data, it must enter a description of the relationship between the entity and that firm or organization. This additional information is not required of service providers. If a governmental or third-party entity uses different methodologies or firms to gather or verify availability data for different providers or technologies, then the entity should identify and describe in the form each methodology or firm/organization used for each associated provider and/or technology. See Sections 7.1 and 7.2 of the Data Specifications document to learn more. Terrestrial fixed wireless broadband service providers that submit availability data in a coverage polygon, or governmental or third-party entities that submit such data about a terrestrial fixed wireless provider's service availability are required to submit supporting information about how they generated their availability data, including propagation model details, base station location and height assumptions, base station carrier details, link budget parameters, and clutter category data. Such information is not required if the provider submits fixed broadband coverage location list data. Terrestrial fixed wireless providers are required to submit a file containing information on the propagation modeling and planning tools used to generate their coverage maps. The propagation model details file must contain a row for each propagation model used to estimate terrestrial fixed wireless broadband coverage. The file must be stored in comma-separated value, or CSV, format and match the specifications found in section 3.7.3.1 of the data specifications document. The image at the bottom of the slide displays an example of a propagation model detail CSV file. We wanted to highlight some information about some of the fields included in the propagation model table. The model ID is a unique identifier that the filer assigns to each propagation model used to generate coverage. The model resolution is the resolution of the model used to generate the coverage data in meters. The value may be approximate for models measured in arc seconds, but it must be greater than 0 and less than or equal to 100. Similarly, terrain resolution and clutter data resolution are measured in meters. Again, while the values may be approximate for datasets measured in arc seconds, they must be greater than 0 and less than or equal to 100. The model calibration process is a text field in which the filer must provide a brief narrative summary of the process used to calibrate the model. If a filer uses more than one propagation model to generate fixed wireless broadband coverage, it must provide a description of the circumstances under which each model is deployed and why in the propagation model conditions explanation part of the BDC system. For example, if a provider submits multiple models at different resolutions, such as a 30-meter resolution for rural areas, a 10-meter resolution for suburban and urban areas, and a 3-meter resolution for dense urban areas, then the filer must include each model as a record in the propagation model details CSV file and explain why it used each model at each resolution in its propagation model conditions explanation. This explanation will be entered in a web form in the broadband data collection system. Filers that use only one propagation model do not need to provide a propagation model conditions explanation. Next, filers of terrestrial fixed wireless broadband availability data will need to submit information about each base station used in the propagation model that generated the coverage areas. The information to be submitted about each base station includes the site ID, the geographic coordinates, height, and morphology of the base station, and the ID of the propagation model used to generate coverage at that base station. The image at the bottom of the slide displays an example of a fixed wireless base station location and height file. The site ID is a unique ID assigned by the filer to identify the base station. The height must be submitted in meters as the height above mean sea level, and morphology must have a value of 1 for urban areas, 2 for suburban, 3 for rural, and 0 for other. This file must be in a CSV format and match the specifications in section 7.4 of the data specifications document. Next, the base station carriers table must include records of each carrier or antenna used in each sector of the fixed wireless provider's base stations. These are the base stations identified in the base station location and height data file described in the previous slides. The base station carriers table must include the base station site ID, the antenna model, technology code, the downlink and uplink link budget IDs, which I will describe in greater detail on the next slide, and the downlink and uplink carrier aggregation frequencies, if any. The file must be uploaded in a CSV format and match the specifications in section 7.5 of the Broadband Data Collection Availability Specifications document. This document has more detailed information on the fields in this table, including the list of technology codes that can be entered to indicate the technology standard used by the channel/carrier described in the record. The image at the bottom of this slide shows an example of a fixed wireless base station carrier's file. Next, terrestrial fixed wireless availability filers are required to submit a file containing information on the parameters and values included in the link budgets used to generate the coverage maps. Note that the file must include separate records for each download link budget and each uplink link budget. If a service provider uses different link budget parameters for different technologies or spectrum bands, then this file must contain records for each set of distinct downlink/uplink link budget parameters. The file must be uploaded in CSV format and include all the fields listed in the table found in section 7.6 of the Data Specifications document. The images at the bottom of this slide display an example of a fixed wireless link budget parameters file, read from left to right, descending. To submit fixed wireless clutter category data, filers should upload a file containing a list of the clutter categories used in the link budgets. The file must include a numerical identifier for each clutter category, a name or short description of each category, the constant or variable signal loss value associated with each category, and the model ID of each propagation model that used the clutter category. Please note the model ID should correspond to a model ID value listed in the mobile propagation model detail file described earlier. In addition, if a constant signal loss value is attributable to a given clutter category, then the value for variable signal loss may be null, and vice versa. The clutter categories must be uploaded in CSV format and must match the specifications found in section 7.7 of the Data Specifications document. The image at the bottom of this slide displays an example of a clutter category data file.
Thanks, Mike. This concludes our tutorial on fixed availability supporting data for the broadband data collection. Thanks again for taking time to watch this tutorial and for your efforts to be ready to submit fixed broadband availability data in the BDC. If you've not already done so, we urge you to watch our companion tutorials on preparing fixed broadband availability data and on the broadband serviceable location fabric. And please remember to periodically check our website at fcc.gov/broadbanddata for links to commission orders, notices, tutorials, FAQs, and other resources. Questions about the BDC filing requirements may be submitted to the FCC by using the Submit a Request button on the Help Center from the link on that webpage. The FCC's broadband maps will play a critical role in the efforts of federal, state, local, and tribal governments to assure that essential broadband services are made available to locations throughout the United States, and that funding is carefully targeted to areas most in need. Timely and accurate data from all providers is therefore of paramount importance. So thank you again for your efforts to prepare for the upcoming filing.